Hello everybody, my name is Radek, I'm a software engineer at Nozbe, and today I wanted to tell you about WatermelonDB, a next generation database for React and React Native. So, some of you maybe are React Native developers or have worked with React Native and already may be familiar with some issues with data persistence and why this is a thing and why this is important to some people. But I know many of you are native iOS and native developers, and I'll be thinking, why? Why talk about React Native? And I know that a lot of native developers are not very much fond of React Native. And this has many complex reasons, but many of them boil down to user experience and in particular performance. And I wanted to, just before I talk about Watermelon, mention context that I think is important here, that React Native is a thing that has existed for about 3 years now, more than 3 years now, and a lot has changed in that time. So I know a lot of people who have looked at React Native like 2 or 3 years ago, and have maybe kind of liked some things about React Native, you know, the developer experience of having instantly reloading simulator and the programming paradigm of components and one-way data passing. And you know, JavaScript is kind of gross, but then like you look at what user experience you can achieve with this technology and you're like, no. But a lot of issues that we've had, like animations and navigation and gesture handling, that are really tricky to do in a way that allows you to make actually a good app with the constraints that JavaScript and other architecture pieces of React Native imposes have been fixed. Data persistence and like data persistence at scale is another issue that we found at Nozbe while adopting React Native. And that was kind of tricky, but we didn't give up on React Native. We saw that in our case, this is a pretty good bet. So instead, we've built more basic infrastructure that we felt was missing. And this is why I'm talking about this here. So if you kind of like the premise of React Native, but not React Native in practice, then I suggest maybe take another look. And if not today, then maybe in like 6 months or so, when like 2 big pieces of infrastructure that are missing, Fabric and Turbo modules, are merged, and that would be awesome. All right, what's WatermelonDB? So WatermelonDB is a new way of dealing with user data persistence in React and React Native. It's a database for building powerful apps that can scale to tens of thousands of records and remains fast. All right, that's all the buzzwords. So what problems does it solve? So let's unpack this a little bit. So first of all, this might be obvious to some of you, but when do you even need a database? I mean, a lot of mobile apps are, I'd call them like online content apps, like a Twitter client or a news app, that are pretty much only meant to be used online. Like all the data is fetched through on all the screens through a REST API query or a GraphQL or something like that. When you have user actions like favoriting a tweet or something like that, that's also meant to be done online. And for offline, you might do like cache. So you're caching online responses for like quick fill start so that you can read news while offline. But this is essentially like content and like requests and caching, like a very different paradigm. And for that, like you need a database. But then you have this another genre of apps, like offline first apps, I'd call them, like a read later client, or a notes management app like Bear, or a management app like Splitwise, or a complex to-do app like project management app like Nozbe or Things or Todoist. And here there's a lot of differences. First of all, this needs to work offline and not just as a cache. You need to be able to do everything that you can do online, offline. Like if you can't like check off a task while you're offline in a to-do app, that would be a terrible to-do app. Second of all, you might have a lot of data over time. Third of all, you often want to show the data in different ways. Like there's a lot of data shuffling around. Like in Nozbe, you might want to see tasks in a project, or tasks tagged with a tag, or tasks in calendar, or tasks marked as priority, right? And fourth of all, while they're offline first, you want to synchronize with the server. You want to be fully capable offline, but you want to synchronize between multiple devices or between like multiple people for something collaborative like Nozbe. And for that, you need a database. So one thing that's important to note for context is that the most popular solution, as far as I can tell, in React and React Native apps is to use an object store like Redux or MobX and just add a persistence adapter. So this is not going to be a perfect analogy. It's more complex than that. But it's essentially as if you were just using a tree structure of like Swift structs or something like that for representing all of your data, and had all of that in memory, and then just like serialized it, dumped it to disk every time you change something, and loaded it from disk every time you launch. And that's actually like a pretty good solution for something really simple. Like it's very simple to use, but it doesn't scale, and especially not in React Native. So in terms of scalability, like for Nozbe, which is again essentially a collaborative to-do app, it's not uncommon to share dozens of projects with dozens of coworkers, and each one of those projects can have dozens of tasks, and in each one of those tasks you have a discussion which can span dozens of comments. And if you do the math, that quickly balloons to thousands or tens of thousands of records. And if you want to deserialize it at every launch and load it to JavaScript heap, that's going to be slow. So the goal of Watermelon is to make fast apps, obviously. And again, I want to clarify a thing that I think a lot of developers might be missing. Like usually when we talk about performance in code, we talk about throughput, like something can do 100,000 operations per second. But I think in the context of mobile app development, a metric which is almost always much more useful to think about is interaction time. Like when I tap on something on the screen, how much time does it take until something happens? Like I don't care if something is terribly inefficient if it still takes like 20 milliseconds, right? And a good rule of thumb is that below 100 milliseconds, this is essentially instant. Like I don't see the loading. And below 300 milliseconds, like an interaction is really fast. And I feel like an interaction which is often neglected by developers is, I think, the most important one because it takes the longest, and that's launching the app. And on a really fast phone like the iPhone 10, an app launching for more than a second already feels kind of slow. But in general, like when talking about like an average Android phone that your customers might have, like 2 or 3 seconds can be like pretty okay on like a slower device. But then I see a lot of apps that take an eternity to launch. Like this is mobile. Like this literally means on the go. I just want to grab my phone, check something for a couple of seconds, get something done, and leave. And when your app takes like 5 or 10 seconds to launch, that's I'm just gonna give up and find a better app that's faster, probably native. And a lot of those apps that are slow to launch are unsurprisingly made using kind of web-based or web-inspired technologies like React Native or Cordova. Though, funny thing, I have completely native apps on my iPhone 10 which take like 5 seconds to launch, and I don't understand how people manage to do that. So anyway, let's make apps launch fast. And that's really challenging to do in React Native. We're dealing with a mobile device, which is going to be 4 to 5 times slower than desktop. Obviously not the new iPad Pro, just faster than this Mac, but like an average 2-year-old cheap iPhone or Android phone. JavaScript is slow, obviously, compared to Swift or Kotlin. And then, like, even worse, JavaScript available in JavaScript core for React Native is going to be slower than JavaScript on the same device in the browser because we don't have just-in-time compilation technology. So some of you might be thinking, okay, I know it, this React Native thing sucks, and there's no way this can be possible to do a reasonable app. But again, those really tricky problems like animations and gesture handling, which need to be like 60 frames per second to be good, you can actually do 60 frames per second and in React Native. And the way people get this done is, yeah, you might be writing app logic in JavaScript, but the idea is that you really do as little work as possible in JavaScript. So when building infrastructure for building React Native apps, you do the minimum possible amount of work. You defer everything you can do later until later. You are asynchronous so that you chop up work into smaller pieces so you don't block the thread. And then you do all the heavy lifting implemented in native code. So that's what Watermelon is. It's a fully lazy loaded database framework. So I want the app to launch essentially instantly, no matter how much data I have, because when you think about it, I might have like 20,000 tasks and projects and comments in my app, but I only need like a couple of dozen of records and counters to like display any screen, right? I don't need all that data. So instead of thinking about an object graph that you can manipulate, map and filter and whatnot in JavaScript, you specify declaratively what you want, you query the database, and then let native code do the actual hard work of computing that. Which is essentially just a database, and there's nothing special about that. Like you can just use SQLite. But there's a second piece that's super, super important, and that's really difficult to combine with lazy loading. And that's full observability. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. Okay. There's a screenshot barely visible of Nozbe on the iPad. So this is a priority list. So all the tasks marked with the star, right? And those tasks belong to projects. And in the sidebar, I have the list of all projects with counters of how many tasks are in that project. So let's do the simplest possible action you can do in a to-do app, which is to like cross off a task. And the action is simple, but it has a lot of effects when you think about it, and they're going to be different depending on the situation. So I want to re-render the task component because it has a different style when it's completed. I want to re-render or reorder the whole list because now it's at the bottom. The counters for how many priority tasks at the bottom and in the top left corner are different. And also, it so happens that since I happen to be looking at the priority side or the project sidebar, I completed a task from a project, so that counter also has to update. Like you don't want to manage it by hand in any way. Like certainly you don't want to trigger effects when you do an action, but you also, like when people try to kind of semi-manually set up observation next to like views or components to like refresh it and re-render, like fetch new data when it might be necessary, like it's very tedious and it's error prone, and there are so many bugs that you have to deal with when you do it manually. Like you just want everything to be reactive, magically. You want to be able to specify declaratively the relationship between the interface and the data, like what the result of what query you want to present, and it should be the framework's responsibility to re-render that view or that component when necessary. So quick example, and I'll explain the syntax for those of you who are not familiar with React Native. So this is a simple task component that's just going to render the task. The component is essentially just a function. It receives one property, task, which is going to be just an instance of the task model. And I'm going to render a view with a tick, which is going to be ticked if the task is completed and the name of the task, right? And this is static. This is just a simple component. And then, like the syntax is not too important. But then like the idea is that you wrap it, you enhance this component with an additional behavior. There's this concept of higher components in React, which is a neat way to compose extra behaviors or extra state on top of simple like pure functions essentially. So here essentially what I'm saying is just that I want this component to have a task property, which is going to be the result of observing of this task object. And the way it works is just like an implementation detail. But essentially this will be updated anytime the task changes, when it needs to update, and never when it doesn't. And then with that we can build a whole list. So we start with just defining a query. We query the tasks collection. We want tasks that are completed or priority but not completed. And then we can make the priority list component. And again, this is just a pure function that takes a property, priority tasks, which is just a simple array of task model instances, just objects. I'm going to render review, and I'm going to map this array to just like render one by one those tasks. And those are going to be those enhanced task components that we render when an individual task changes. But then the whole list is enhanced and made observable. And I'm just going to inject this priority tasks property with the result of observing the query for priority tasks. And then we get a simple version of Nozbe, essentially. And not only will the individual task re-render when the task changes, but also the whole list when it needs to reorder or when there's a new task that's priority and it needs to be added to the list, or one is deleted, then it will just re-render when it needs to. And everything else, like all the counters, are defined the same way. It's just, it's just a pure function that just renders a number with the result of observing the count for a query. And I don't have to like think about how to route the data, when to re-render, when not to. It's an implementation detail. And then there's a whole big bunch of other performance tricks that we do in Watermelon and you can do in general in like good React Native infrastructure to achieve good performance. One of those things, like React Native in general, is by default very much asynchronous and multi-threaded, which is really interesting. Like, I don't know about Android, but I think all iOS developers had this experience of writing like a complex collection view or something like that, and then like it just doesn't scroll smoothly. Like, even though it's native and all that stuff, but it's just like it's still too much work on one thread. And React Native is like interesting because when you see performance issues, it's the interaction time. Like you tap on something and it's not fast enough. Like something doesn't happen fast enough. But scrolling is almost always 100% smooth because there's actually not a lot happening on the main thread. And then like Watermelon is going to run. So Watermelon runs neither in the main thread nor in the JavaScript thread. It just has its own thread, which for like a lot of data in the database is still a nice win. And then there's caching and batching and other cool stuff. So another thing, Watermelon is it's a multi-platform, and that's not just iOS and Android on React Native. It also runs on the web in the web browser, and it has this adapter architecture. Like it's essentially like it's not really a database. It's a high-level reactive JavaScript API, and there's an adapter layer where you can hook up essentially any underlying database like SQLite or what have you. So it's pretty trivial to add like support to like native macOS or Windows or anything. And like I know not a lot of native developers are necessarily convinced about the rightness of this approach of React and React Native to be multi-platform. Like we're thinking of, write once, run everywhere, which is it just produces terrible products. But the way that the React Native community is trying to go and move forward is to provide as much as possible all the native components that you need to actually get native interface, right? And you do need to spend time to make a good React Native app so that it actually does conform to the platform and the standard, and so it's performant enough to be a good experience. But when you think about it, like what usually happens when you make an app for different platforms and they're all native is you have different teams, and much of what they're doing is they're rewriting from scratch the same code that does the same logic over and over again. That's kind of crazy. Like, of course, there are ways around it. You can write common code in C++ or something, but then you want to ship on the web, and that's a problem too. So, like, where the React Native community wants to go is to, write once the stuff that is the same, and then write everywhere when it's not. All right, synchronization. So Watermelon is for offline first apps, and what you want to do is you want to have a full local copy of all your data, but then synchronize with the server, right? And Watermelon, there are solutions out there which are like automatically synchronizes out of the box with the server, like think Core Data and iCloud, or Realm, Firebase, etc. But what we find, and what a lot of developers are finding when using those, out-of-the-box magically syncing solutions, is that when you get to a certain level of complexity, you want your own custom backend. Like a ready-made solution just doesn't do everything you want to do, and this is where we found ourselves in. Like, yeah, it's cool that Realm or something else might sync automatically, and there's a backend that's already there, but we need our own backend. So Watermelon is not that. It doesn't sync automatically. It does all the local side synchronization primitives. It does all the tracking of the changes, like everything you created, deleted, updated, and how you updated it locally since the last synchronization. And very soon there will be published like the whole sync adapter code if you don't want to like hook it up to your own remote server, like completely from scratch. And so essentially what you'll need to do to synchronize Watermelon with any custom or any existing backend is just have 2 API calls that conform to a certain format on your server, and then you can synchronize with Watermelon. So it's easy to plug in your own sync engine. So in terms of quality, Watermelon has been out in open source for about 2 months. It's got like 5,000 stars, which kind of shows you that this was a problem in React Native. It's not 1.0 yet, but we've been using it in development for 1.5 years now. And there's some people that have early successes in adapting it in production. And yeah, speaking of quality, it's really well tested and aesthetically typed. Again, another misconception is that JavaScript today is the same as 5 years ago. But more and more people are using Flow like we do, or TypeScript, so that you know that this object is not who knows, but it's actually a thing, or it's not null. So I'll just show you a very quick demo to prove to you some of the points. I pre-recorded it on my iPhone. So I'm just going to launch this demo app. OK. So you can't see it, but there's a launch timer that measures the time from native code start to like full upload, and it says 200 milliseconds or so. And I can generate like 100 records. That's not a lot. Let's hit generate 10,000 records. And then when I'll kill the app and launch it again, it still launches 200 milliseconds. I mean, why wouldn't it? Like, there's just like 20 items here and 20 counters. So this is just like an imaginary app for managing blogs and blog posts and comments, just to kind of show off like Watermelon API and features. So next to each one of the blogs here, there's a counter of how many posts are on that blog. And this is all fake data, obviously. So I'll just go to fake Mac rumors. There's posts, a number of comments. There's some comments here, and next to some of them, there's a sad face emoji. Those are nasty comments because people are sometimes nasty on the internet. And then when I'll get back to the whole list, swipe, then you'll see nasty comments, and there's a counter. So this is all nasty comments on all posts on that blog, and essentially a moderation queue, right? And if I hit moderate, I'll delete all of those nasty comments, and the counter will go to 0, but then there are other counters that happen to depend on that data, and they'll update themselves. Like, they'll just re-render when needed. I don't have to do anything. It just works. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And then just to show you, this is on a slow Android phone. And there's 10,000 records generated, and it launches in about a second, which is actually, like, it doesn't look great when you're used to iPhone 10, but on this phone, this is pretty decent. Yeah, this is really not bad on this phone. And yeah, it works the same way. So that was a demo. And how do you make such a demo? Like, essentially, it's pretty straightforward, so I don't want to go into too many details. Like, if you used any sort of database thing, it's pretty familiar. It's just all the cool stuff are behind the scenes. So you start by just defining the schema, so the table and the column types for a kind of thing, like post has a title, subtitle, blog ID, just for the underlying database to understand this. And then you like quickly upgrade it to like a reactive JavaScript instance. So you extend model, you say this post, this is backed by the posts table. This associates and actually belongs to blogs, like a post belongs to a blog and has many comments. And then you define a field, so essentially properties of the model, right? And then you can define more things in a very simple way using this decorator syntax, which is really useful, and we could use it in Swift. So for example, when you want to do post.blog, this is not the blog instance. This is a relation that points to a blog, because Watermelon is like fully asynchronous. So you need to fetch it or observe it to see what the blog is. So you just have that object that represents the blog, and you define it like this. Or you want to do post that comments, so that's not an array, it's a query, and you can define it using the children decorator. And when you want to do like something custom, like you want to have a nasty comments property on a blog instance, then you query comments collection, and you say, I want all comments that belong to a post that belong to this blog and are nasty. And then like basic CRUD, like create, update, delete. Again, pretty straightforward. They're just like create method on a collection, and you set things. So yeah. Yeah, and all the details, the installation guide, the documentation, the demo code, and more info is at GitHub, Nozbe/WatermelonDB. Again, I would recommend you, if you do use React Native, you might want to check it out depending on your needs for your next project. And if you don't use React Native, then maybe Watermelon is not the thing that's going to sell you or anything, but I would like to take the opportunity to tell you, yeah, check it out. Like it's better than it used to be. And of course, I'm on the internet at RXP and at rx.io. And if you like the work we're doing at Nozbe with open source and everything, then send us an email. All right, thanks.
I have a question. Name Watermelon. Where did it come from?
I don't know, I just like watermelons. I thought that sounds kind of funny. Like, a good name is not descriptive, it just, like everybody is asking why it's called watermelon, which is why it's a good name, because people are like, oh, watermelon, that's kind of interesting. Why is it called watermelon? People are thinking about the name. That's good marketing.